Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ke tēnei hui, ki te mana whenua rangitānei, he mihi nui. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morning everyone, welcome to the Planning and Strategy Committee for June. Just a welcome to the visitors in the chamber this morning. So we are currently live streaming, and right now technology is working really well for us. So just in terms of the health and safety, obviously if there's an emergency we'll follow our committee administrators out to Te Marae Ohene, and we have got a defibrillator on the ground floor if we need to access that, and if we need anything please touch base with committee administrators. We've got 3 councillors online this morning, Councillor Dingwall, Bowen and Meehan. And we'll be voting electronically today, so we'll be using our devices. So just going to apologies, we've got an apology from the Mayor on council business. Are there any other apologies? Great. Well, I will move that the apologies be received from the Mayor, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Open for comments. Councillor Bowen.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I was popping in to say I'll be an apology for early departure.
Thank you. We'll add that in.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. And that is carried unanimously. We'll just note that the online votes have been recorded and they'll be included and represented through the minutes for the meeting. So moving on to item 2, I haven't had notification of any additional items. Are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On item 5, I noticed the presentation is going to talk about housing options, particularly transitional housing. I'm involved with Homes for People, but I don't see that being a conflict, even though I'm in that service delivery space.
Thank you for noting that.
Without knowing what they're going to cover in their presentation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Right, moving on. I don't believe that Kerry Hockard is here just yet, so we will skip public comment and come back to that. We'll move on to item 5, which is a presentation from Mash Trust. We've got Carleen Edwards, the Chief Executive, who is going to be presenting that, and we've got a PowerPoint which we'll just organise to get up on the screen. Morena, if you could just make sure that your microphone's on before you start and perhaps introduce everybody for those who are not familiar, but you can start when you're ready.
Thank you. A tiha Māori ora, ina mana, ina reo, I rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would like to introduce the people with me. So I have apologies from John Falk, who's our Chair of MASH and LUC, Peter Durangi, Board Member, well known to Council and to our communities, and Christina Hemmingston, probably also well known to Council, leading the strategic development of LUC. So who are we? Well, MASH has been around for 31 years in your community. We deal with mental health, drug and alcohol, disability, youth services, housing support and social services. And we cover a wide range of the lower North Island, from Palmerston over to the Hawke's Bay, down to Wellington and Lower Hutt and areas in between. LUC is a service that directly supports MASH supports about 2,000 people and daily, and we have about 650 employees, so we're a largish organisation. LUC, our sister organisation, is a service that directly supports about 890 people per year who are the most vulnerable and hidden people in our communities. Perhaps homeless or unemployed, but with a multitude of complex social, mental health, disability and physical issues. Community members who need multiple agency support, but frequently receive little access to those. At times, people need medical attention, a shower or some food, and mostly a sense that they're accepted without judgment and a sense of belonging. LUC Outreach Services also support whānau across the region, including people who at times may experience housing insecurity, be sleeping in a car or a park, or on a friend's couch or garage. And although we're primarily a health and disability community service, we're essentially about inclusion, linking people with services when they fall between the gaps, supporting whānau and building communities, no matter where or why they enter our services. We deal with all of those things. So we're part of the community here, but also the people that we support are part of the community. We already have a significant role in homelessness and housing insecurities. For instance, we provide 34 houses, social housing in partnership with the Palmerston North City Council. Emergency housing support in partnership with MSD for 80 people. Supported accommodation in partnership with Mid-Central DHB for 22 beds. And LUC is currently supporting identified 7 people who are single homeless males. Support in terms of blankets, food, clothing, support in terms of working alongside the men to engage with MSD and to find accommodation long term. But today we want to talk to you a little bit about your decision to fund a feasibility study for a night shelter for homelessness as a significant provider locally for people with insecure housing. First of all, we applaud the Council for recognition of a problem that sadly exists in our city, but one that is often hidden. Homelessness and insecure housing is underreported everywhere, but it's an increasing problem in our city as it is in any other city. Even a census of people sleeping rough will only pick up a portion of those in needs. Much is hidden and many do not receive any assistance at all. So statistics suggest that severe housing deprivation is disproportionately experienced by Māori, Pacific peoples, people with disabilities, mental health and AOD issues, and single parent families. In fact, many of the same people that we see on a daily basis. But single men are the last on the priority list for housing, and that's generally who you see on the streets. Homelessness for women and their children in particular is hidden, either because families couch surf or they get into inappropriate relationships really for the sole purpose of putting a roof over their children's head. And that leads to other social issues. But you've identified this problem and you've generously approved $100,000 for a feasibility study into a night shelter. But a night shelter is not a permanent home, neither is emergency housing. In our visits to housing services in the South Island, it's been found that a night shelter or emergency housing options on their own right may in fact perpetuate a current situation, they at least maintain a status quo and of the whānau, and they don't lead to independence. It doesn't relieve their problem for more than a few nights. Instead, it takes a village, it takes communities, and it takes providers working together to solve what is really a very complex issue. And we believe that the Housing First is a well-proven and successful model internationally and nationally, and you heard about that at your March meeting, I understand. But essentially, Housing First is a collaboration between, with the first priority being to find permanent housing for the whānau, then wrapping around the services that they require to live a good life and keep that housing. Transitional housing focuses on the most disadvantaged and works to build their skills and ability to hold a tenancy to live with others and possibly to access vocational training in the future. It's a journey to somewhere, it's not just a stopgap measure. So our recommendation, based on the people that we see and support every day, and because of the work that we do every day, we believe that the best option is to develop a comprehensive and long-term plan, a plan that addresses the underlying issues and results in permanent housing solutions. There are many providers and agencies in our region that are already working in this space, as we heard earlier, and are willing to assist and collaborate together. And we'd recommend that the funds could be used to bring providers and government agencies together to implement a housing first model in Palmerston North. We can do it together, but it will take all of us to make a sustained difference. There's enough work for everybody. We've visited and learnt lessons from examples of night shelters and the housing first models, and the collaboration we are recommending builds on the strengths of providers that are already working in the space and is the most effective way to deal with what's a very complex issues. And as I said, there's enough work for everyone. The council doesn't need to solve this issue on its own, but it could lead it or fund another agency to get on with building those long-term solutions. And any effective and sustainable solution will occur through building relationships at all levels and building on the strengths and capabilities of the providers and agencies working on these issues. And there are many of us willing to work together on this. And so together, I think that we could do this. And our whakatauki says it all: adorn the bird with feathers so that it can fly. Tēnā koutou katoa katoa. I'd just like to ask if our team would like to say anything.
Thank you, Carleen. Just to add to that, I mean, we know from the research that Professor Sir Mason Jury has given us that 75% of Māori live outside their tribal areas, and they form the major negative statistics in need in our communities. And I'm very much in favour of supporting this initiative of Housing First and working collaboratively with other organisations. And I salute the council for prioritising 100,000 to this initiative, or to an initiative. Thank you.
Christina?
Haven't been here for a while. We're on Orange. I suppose just to tautoko the kōrero that has happened this morning, and what I've noticed being part of this community for so many years is that during our time of COVID, we were better together, mahi-tahi, like we worked, I look at faces around these tables and I think of the collaborative partnerships that really supported our community and their well-being. Yeah, ngā mihi.
Happy for any questions.
Kia ora, there are questions. First up, we've got Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, and thanks for coming and speaking to us today. I guess I just would like to get a little bit more clarity. You've suggested that the night shelter and emergency housing is not a permanent solution, and the higher priority is the need for permanent housing. And you've acknowledged the 100,000 that we've invested, that we've assigned to the feasibility study for a night shelter. Are you suggesting that both should happen, or are you suggesting that we should be reallocating that funding towards the more permanent housing solution in collaboration with others?
Thank you. It's a really good question. I guess in terms of what we'd like to see is the reallocation of funds to actually look at a longer-term sustainable solution that which may well include night shelter and emergency housing. And from the day you open a night shelter, it will be full. But it doesn't actually solve the problem of people churning through those services. The Housing First model is a proven model that actually finds people permanent accommodation, and then they can deal with the other issues that are wrapped around it. And from what we're seeing, that if you can find people a permanent home, then provide them with the mental health services, drug and alcohol services, or social services that they need, they're likely to stay in those situations and then not churn through the other services. So a housing plan may include all of those, or it may be focused on Housing First.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, could I ask a question of the officers?
Right now we're doing questions for the presenters, so we'll just hold that question for staff. When we have moved the recommendation to receive it, you can ask it then.
Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks very much for coming in this morning and just to talk to us about particularly homelessness, I guess. Just in terms of the pathway from night shelter, emergency housing, transitional housing, and I guess the gap, which is really around sort of the housing first model, which is the more permanence. Do we actually have a really good understanding for Palmerston North in terms of the quantum or the scale of that?
We don't. We could do a census, or council could do a census around that. We've got anecdotal evidence and evidence from the likes of MSD and other government agencies in terms of who uses emergency housing. The problem is that a lot of home insecurity and homelessness is hidden, as I've mentioned, particularly for women and children.
Yeah, okay, which brings me probably to the next part, which is really, so there is, I suppose your plea here really is for council to think about how we could actually play a part in actually coordinating that and actually sort of starting to pull that together. Is that a fair
Yes,
assessment?
either council coordinating or funding an agency to coordinate. Doesn't have to be us, but providers and agencies are willing to come together, but it will take some time to sort out some things, build the relationships, identify how you would develop a plan, but also a model that's sustainable into the future.
Great, thanks, Carly. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ms. Edwards, for your presentation and bringing the team along. Just my understanding around Housing First is that it's not a terribly new thing. It's more that it's new to us. Are there examples, preferably locally within Aotearoa, where communities have done or are doing this well that we might look to?
Yes, so we visited the one in Christchurch because we were visiting other services around housing and security, but there is one in Wellington that's been established. There's Auckland, Waikato, Wellington and Christchurch.
Great, thank you.
And some smaller centres actually, from my recollection.
Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd just like to acknowledge the work that Mash and Luck venues do for the city. You mentioned the seven homeless people that you're dealing with at the moment. Would you be able to take me through the process of how they will, what barriers are in place for them to be able to get housing?
I might hand over to Christina, who's dealing with that on a daily basis.
Kia ora anō. So these are people that have come into Luck and started to, as we have engaged with them, they've started to tell their story and talk about what's happening for them and why they are homeless. So each situation is unique and different. I guess, what were you actually
So what I'm trying, it's not so much the people, it's MSD and Kaingaroa. We seem to be having a lot of houses built, so at what point will those people be able to find housing, or is it a different type of housing that we require for them?
So I spoke with someone yesterday who works in the space of emergency accommodation, and predominantly single men are in, they're in lodges, and if you're a single female, these are just at the moment what's happening. The stats can be in motels, but there's a small portion of single females who are also in lodges. So at times that may fall over or they may be full. There's a whole lot of different scenarios. But the team are working closely with these people to connect them with accommodation.
So if I may, Madam Chair, so even the lodges are not what I would call a home or boarding. So we never seem to be able to get past that step of actually, so what sort of is the, what is the appropriate homes for these people?
So I think it varies on the people. So if you go and look at transitional housing, a transitional housing program, because again, you don't just want transitional housing, you want to be able to take people on a journey, to actually build them to be rent ready, to be able to live with other people, to know how to go to the supermarket and buy their food and to cook their food. So for instance, Christchurch, the mission is setting up transitional housing, an 8-week program that actually does that, and those houses are actually, it's a shared flatting, so they have a room and an ensuite, but shared cooking, a supermarket, little mini supermarket down below and those sorts of things, and they also get them into vocational training. But other people need different things, so some people on the streets have a dog, and they need to have a place where their friend and their family is able to live as well. So it's a mixture of, social housing, council housing, private landlords, and a range of different things depending on the people. But your question before about what are the barriers, if you don't have an address, you can't access some of the income supports. If you don't have an address, you can't actually access some other things such as medical, mental health, those sorts of things. So that's why finding a house and a roof over your head is, Maslow's law in terms of those things are the important things. Then you can wrap around services to actually move them on and to address all those other issues. If you don't have somewhere to sleep or food to eat, you're not going to be worried about going to get the voices in your head treated or whatever. No. So it is quite individual, and that's what the good thing about Housing First is, because you have a variety of providers involved. People can be referred to different areas and to get the support that they need and the type of housing that they need.
In Christchurch, they talked about the different providers that we went to talked about people who had been on the streets for many years who were had found permanent accommodation and it had been successful, and they talked about not having one specific type of accommodation. There needed to be a variety so the accommodation was the right fit for the person. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming and speaking to us today. In terms of the transitional housing and emergency housing, similar to what Councillor Beattie was saying, we're often hearing that people end up going into these situations and staying there for quite a while because there simply isn't housing available for them. And so I'm wondering, with the idea of a night shelter, and the idea of Housing First, whether you would think it is one or the other, or whether we could, whether you would recommend having actually both to sort of catch those people who, urgently need it for those short-term couple of days before they end up in the transitional or emergent, to sort of, I guess, have all the levers going, rather than the situation we've got now with people staying in transitional and emergency for quite some time. So I'm just wondering whether you think it's one or the other, or whether you think both could happen at the same time.
No, I think they're all important because sometimes the night shelter or emergency housing is a way into services. Mm-hmm. So that might be the only way that you capture and or somebody is able to access services longer term. But it's not an answer in itself. So it's a step. The problem is that you need something else around it, so that if somebody's staying more than 2 nights, then you need to have some sort of program or some sort of plan to actually link them into everything else. There's not much point in it just having people come in, for a couple of nights and then disappear because they'll be back. And it doesn't actually move them on from their situation. And I guess that's what I mean by having a plan that looks at all of those things. And again, it's not that the council has to do all that, but bringing providers together and agencies like MSD and HUD so that we can work together and we can solve these issues together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for your presentation. Council already funds the Housing Needs Advisory group, which meets on a regular basis, and that brings all of the emergency and transitional providers together on a regular basis. How would you see the Housing First model as being substantially different to that?
Because that, in terms of bringing providers together, the Housing First model is actually a service. So people that need the services come in, or they're identified and then referred on to the right services, and those supports are provided to them, as opposed to providers just coming together. So it's actually a service as opposed to a group that comes together, if you like.
Okay.
You see, I'm probably not being very clear, but
I am struggling to see what you think is missing in the current setup that we don't have. So, for instance, in terms of a service, we have the Housing Advice Centre, where someone who homeless can go and get advice about how to link into services. And we have any number of emergency and transitional providers in the city that people can access.
Exactly.
And my understanding, which may be wrong, is that the big problem is lack of housing rather than lack of services. But so if you can just clarify the advantages you see in the Housing First model, that would be helpful, I think.
So from what you describe, is the person comes in and then is giving advice on where to go or referred to where to go. What the Housing First does is that the services connect as opposed to the person having to go to various areas. So they're the ones that do the work, identify what the issues are and provide those services. So it changes in terms of the accountability about providing the service. To that. The other thing is that we do have lots of providers providing bits of service, and there's, in my view, there will be a lot of wastage in terms of, everybody having to have their different referral systems and different processes and all the rest of it, whereas coming together doesn't mean they lose their identity or anything like that, but it's actually about making it a more efficient process for everybody and also a more complete process. The other thing is that I still go back to the sense that emergency housing and night shelter is like a stopgap. You need a plan further than that, so that when people have finished their time at the night shelter or the emergency housing, there's a plan going forward, or they're developing some skills to actually take them further, and so that into permanent housing. So it's not about there's enough work for everybody. It's about how do we connect and make it more efficient and effective, and moving people through the system, if you like. And housing is a problem, but I know that government agencies are keen to look at how they can support in terms of provision of housing. But we need to have a plan and a process for that. They're not just going to build houses, and then just leave them out there, if you like. We need to have a proper process in place to be able to use them and utilise them effectively.
Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. 2 quick questions. Would it surprise you to know that there are people staying in some of the temporary lodges in Palmerston North that have been there since 2001?
Would not surprise me at all.
Okay. Quick question also is, would you say that if we had an abundance of one-bedroom houses available in Palmerston North, it would address the situation?
For some people, a one-bedroom house would be perfect, or a small flat, because a lot of people don't want a big place. A lot of people don't want to live with other people. But not everybody is in that situation, but certainly that would make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carleen, Christina and Peter. There's no further questions for you, so thank you for making the time to come in and present to us this morning. And just a reminder to councillors, we've got the budget allocated towards the feasibility study in the draft annual budget. So that is, well, you're all familiar with how far through we are that process, but that's not yet signed off. Of course, I'm not suggesting anybody's not going to support it, but just so you know that that's set for the following financial year. Sorry, I might be corrected.
Yes, so we did kick the work off. I think we agreed a few months back that we would just start the work this year and see what we could get done in the current financial year, but it will still go over into the next financial year. So the contract for looking at options has been let and that work has begun. It's been a bit delayed with COVID, but they are underway.
Thank you. I apologise for that. I was thinking of the carry forward that was going in. So yes, that is underway. Thank you for that. Councillor Naylor, you did have a question for the Chief Executive.
So I can ask that now, or did you want to move the recommendation?
You can ask that now.
So that work that is underway, do longer-term sustainable solutions, is that included in the scope?
My understanding is that the scope is reasonably broad, so it's not just looking at the feasibility of a night shelter, it is looking at options. So I think effectively the approach that our team has got in terms of looking at this is probably very, very much in line with the presentation that we've seen today in terms of looking at wide options. But I mean, it doesn't cut anything out, I guess.
That's good to hear. So we wouldn't need to change anything in order to be expecting that to be included. We wouldn't need to be changing any of the scope. You're suggesting that's already a part of the scope that's currently been undertaken?
I'm not that close to it, but I would have thought it is, because at the moment it is just looking at all options. So yeah, I think it'll probably cover the wider situation, with the wider issues. So I would think you'd be comfortable that it's been covered.
Okay, thank you.
So I will move that the presentation be received for information, seconded by Councillor Hapera. Thank you. We'll open up for comments. Councillor Hancock.
Yes, sorry, Madam Chair. Just probably just continuing on from Councillor Naylor's question there is, I guess my observation of the presentation really is that there's seemingly a gap around the continued care and support for the people that actually travel through that process from night shelter through to emergency housing and transitional housing and so on. I just was probably going to ask whether or not our community development team would have the capacity to actually be able to pick up a small piece of that work to make sure that we start to understand the coordination requirements around that. So that's a question.
I think that the Chief Executive responded to Councillor Naylor's question to say that the scope is pretty broad and they're aware of the issues, and I mean, I don't think that the presentation gave any surprises in terms of what we're hearing. So we are going to move into comment now. If you'd like to make a comment, you can make a comment, otherwise we'll move on.
Feel free to move on, Madam Chair. Thanks.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Having been at the housing monitoring meetings, I can assure councillors that there's been a lot of conversations with some of the drivers from that feasibility study. But I do want to make sure, through the CE, if I may, is to make sure that that scope is picked up. So at the early stages, because I know the contract's only just been signed, so there's no reason at all why that scope can't be making sure that what MASH has delivered here today can be picked up. And it just makes sense. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly, firstly, to acknowledge MASH and Ms. Edwards for speaking to us. I was much encouraged by the presentation and the response to questions. My main thought and comment at this stage is I think we probably need to be a little bit circumspect about how thinly we can actually spread what is actually a fairly small amount of money to tackle a mountain of a problem. And I'll be probably right in predicting that the main finding of that feasibility assessment is that we will need to keep working, keep investing, keep partnering, et cetera. And I hope that that initial step whets our appetite to keep on the journey and that we don't decide that we're too poor or too distracted to actually look after the fundamental rights of people in our community.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to comment. I'm not sure if there's perhaps been some misunderstanding somewhere about where the idea for a night shelter came from or what council's role in it would be. But I'll just remind everybody that this was a request that came to us from the community, from people who are working with homeless people on a regular basis. And it came to us through submissions. It wasn't that council woke up one fine morning and thought it'd be a good idea to do a night shelter. So was in response to community requests, and that there was a step before we went to the feasibility where we asked for an initial report, and that involves staff consulting with a large number of community organisations involved in the housing space and reporting back to council. So there's that. The other thing is that at no stage was it suggested either that council would be the one to run the night shelter or build a night shelter or whatever, or that that would be the only response of council to the housing issues of the day, of which I think we're all very well aware. So I wouldn't like people to get the idea that we somehow think that the feasibility study for the night shelter will solve all problems, because that is definitely not the case. We have looked at what might be required for us to address some of the issues of housing in the city, and it's at every level. It's at the emergency level, the transitional level, it's at the entry level into rental housing, it's enough rental houses, it's first home buyers, it's at every single level of the housing continuum. And I have got confidence that we are quite well aware of that. So whilst I understand that housing first model is working quite well in some other places, I'm reasonably confident that there's a wide range of effective services in Palmerston North that are well coordinated, that do speak to one another and that do provide good services. And so, I think when the feasibility report comes back, it may well indicate a different direction. We're not committed to going down the night shelter road at this point, but what we have done is recognise that there is a gap in emergency provision and looking into what more could be done, not necessarily, I add again, by us, but by the community as a whole. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Homelessness is something that's been with us for thousands of years, and it will always be here with us. There are those who are out there sleeping rough who want to sleep rough, and they don't want to sleep inside. But unfortunately, in our society, we have many people who fall through the gaps, and very little is done. But we're in a city where there are quite a few organisations that are trying very hard to help with homelessness, and they're doing it very successfully. Probably the most successful lot was the MASH group themselves. I don't think council themselves should be even looking at getting involved with it. What we should be doing is looking to help other organisations address the problem. It's not a council problem, because we'll never be able to successfully do it, and it will cost us too much because we're an organisation that depends on bureaucrats. If we give $100,000 to one of the organisations that are helping out there, it would make a huge difference. We'll spend $100,000 on getting reports. But if you give $100,000 to MASH, Legacy Housing, Homes for People, something like that, it doesn't make a difference. I just wonder why we spend so much time on getting reports and what's going to come out of it with a bit of knowledge, and we'll just find out what we already knew. If we're going to spend $100,000, let's do something with it and support one of the organisations that are actually out there doing something. That's my opinion.
Councillor Beattie, are you back in for a second round of comments?
Yes, I just want to I have to comment after Councillor Finlay. Council is an enabler, and we already fund the Housing Monitoring Needs Group through grants, and all we're doing is bringing all these organisations together, and as you can see, we've got MASH and Luck Venue in here today, so it's important that we get all the stakeholders together and come up with a plan. And whatever outcome the feasibility is, it may be a night shelter, it may recommend the housing first model, it may recommend nothing at all, but we've got to start somewhere, and I'm absolutely sick of the talk fest that we've been having for many years, and if we can get a feasibility study, a plan, and then we need to have the right people to push those plans through and work with the appropriate government agencies and council, iwi, and a partnership. And we need to just actually do something. So I think the $100,000 in the piece of paper might give us some authenticity to actually drive something through this time.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. From time to time, people present here, and I think that's a catalyst for us to stop and think about the work that we do and ask the question, are we on the right track? I think it's been a really useful exercise for us to reflect on that today, and certainly I've been reminded about some of the stuff we are doing in this space. I feel reassured by the Chief Executive that the work that is underway, that the scope is broad enough, that the information that comes back to us will be useful in helping inform us about whether we're doing the work we should be doing in this space, or whether there's any additional work that we should be doing in this space, or if we should be doing anything differently. So I think that's something I feel I'm looking forward to that report, and I do think it's important for us to be active in this space. It's part of the requirements under the Local Government Act for us to be, interested in social well-being. So we absolutely need to be in this space. And I don't like spending lots of money on reports either, but if it gives us useful information about the most appropriate way forward, then that's a sensible thing to do. And I mean, obviously today is not about deciding on that. That's already been decided and that's underway. So I look forward to the report and feel that we have some benefit from an important group in our community highlighting some very real issues. So I think it's been useful.
Thank you. There's no further comments, so I will put the vote. And that has carried 100%. Just in terms of update on the agenda, Kerry Hockard, who was coming to make a public comment, is going to come into Community Development Committee this afternoon. So we'll look forward to that. Moving down to item 6, confirmation of minutes. Now, it was my intention to move the minutes from the 11th of May, part 1 and 2 together, unless there are comments on part 2, in which case we can move into part 2 at the end. Is there, Councillor Hancock will second, is there any indication now that people might like to make a comment on the part 2 minutes? Perfect. So I will move that the minutes of Planning and Strategy Committee meeting of 11 May 2022, Part 1 public and Part 2 confidential, be confirmed as true and correct record. That is seconded by Councillor Hancock. I'll open up for any comment. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to query the bottom of page 11, 2622. There's an indication there around addition to the work schedule. I'm not sure if I've read the work schedule right or read the minutes right, and just wanted to confirm the intent there and whether that's been picked up or will be picked up in your committee.
Yes, the consent progress updates will be on the work schedule for this committee.
Great, and just to note then that they're not yet.
Yeah, we'll we'll add that in the work schedule.
Thank you.
Right, no further comments, so I will invite you to vote. Councillor Hapara, are you voting? You push number 3. Thank you for that. Right, that has carried 14 in favour with 1 abstention. Excuse me, right. Moving on to item 7, page 13, we've got the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan update. We do have, actually for this item and item 7, a couple of staffing changes. I'll just hand over to the Chief Planning Officer to update on who's presenting.
Morena koutou committee. Just by way of update, we've got 2 reports out of the planning team today, the Civic and Cultural Precinct update, memorandum and the Akotiri plan change. So we have 6 staff away sick or isolating from the planning team at the moment. Amongst those are Jono Ferguson-Pye, our City Planning Manager, who's been leading the Civic and Cultural Precinct work alongside David Warburton. Amongst those is also Michael Duandam, Principal Planner, who's been leading the Akotiri plan change. So just by way of update for item 7, amongst those also is Keegan Aplin-Thane, who's at home with on parental leave. He's been leading the on-the-ground engagement on the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan. So in terms of item 7, we'll have, as always planned, we'll have David Warburton, Project Director, presenting that shortly. Alongside him is Kathy McCartney, who's been supporting the ARUP team with the engagement. And with item 8, the Akotiri plan change, we've got Shannon Johnson, partner at CR Law. So I'll be joining Shannon to help present item 8. So
in summary, Mr Murphy's happy to take all the hard questions that would have been passed on to his team. Morning, David and Kathy. I'll hand it over to you and we will get your presentation up. Presentations for the next item. We'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, councillors. Good to be back again. So this is largely a conversation that you want to have. So I just want to make some very quick summary comments, and Kath will be able to answer a number of the questions you might have on detail in terms of some of the stakeholder engagements and the ongoing comment from that. And Olivia's here as well, I think still, yes, in terms of the comms. So we've got some follow-up on that. Just by way of introduction, I just want to summarise where we're at very quickly before I hand it over to the council. I'm going to take the report as read so that we don't go through that. I think we're all agreed that the city needs a vibrant city centre. We need to have a master plan so that that vision is agreed and there's a long-term plan for us to work to. So I think we've got some coherence around that. We're also all aware that a number of the buildings in the city centre that we collectively are responsible for have got little red flags on them. We've had about 15 years when that was flagged. We've got about 12 years left before we need to do something with that. So there is a sense of a burning platform that has to be addressed as part of the master plan and how we manage that. The work that's been done to date has largely been a collection of community input. We're all aware of the consortium that was selected to do this work has got a lot of international experience. What we wanted was to ensure that they actually collected all the local experience and the local nuance, and particularly the iwi flavour and history, to bring that in. And that was what was presented last time in terms of the work that they had picked up and the work that they had done. The presentation made last time was the first and a very delayed, unfortunately due to COVID and other circumstances, update on where they were at. And the next stages in this process really are the presentation of the integration of that, the international flavour, and the next steps in the process to feed into the long-term plan. Council quite wisely said, let's just pause because of delay and where we're at. That's been done. The consortium are on hold in terms of the work, and today's conversation is really to say, what would the plan look like going forward to pick that up, utilise the work that's been done, put any flavour on it additional that the council would want, and have a plan to go forward that can utilise the existing capabilities, the existing agreements, and move through to feed into the normal processes that we would have collectively in terms of the long-term plan on the next stages. So I think that, if you like, gives an overview of where we're at the moment, and it's really, today's conversation, Madam Chair, is really for councillors to decide the next steps in the process and how they would like to handle it. Back to you.
Thank you, David. Kathy, did you want to add anything at this stage? Ready for questions? Okay. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is about the budget. So the recommendation is that we refer an additional $350,000 to complete the master plan. If we were not to agree to that, what are the consequences?
The work that was, the contract was structured with the advice of the Chief Executive and procurement, so that that effectively terminates at the end of this month. And so that would just require us to wrap up the final reporting to the stage that they've got to in that program, and there would be no further consequences other than that work would stop and that consortium would dissolve.
Okay, thank you. And then a question for Kathy in terms of the stakeholder involvement. There's been some questions asked, I suppose, about how much involvement different sections of the community have had in the discussions up to date, and particularly the multicultural communities. Can you make some comment on that engagement with those community groups?
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. So my comment would be that Multicultural Council was engaged with by Keegan, and they've had engagement. However, I think an overarching comment I'd make about the engagement to date has been, it's been through workshops, so people coming in online through online workshops because of COVID and other reasons. And also when I came into the scene, it was the beginning of going out and talking to various groups. So up until the point where we came to the council meeting where things went on pause, we were just beginning to get onto a roll of going out to the groups, and then that paused. So I've completely stopped doing anything or any engagement. So we haven't had the opportunity to go out to individual groups as much as we would have liked. And I guess, you know, one of the things that's really important is that the Community Services Council have been engaged with, the Multicultural Council have been had a meeting and have had input as well back in through the workshops. So the intention was that that would grow over time to other groups to be engaged with and talk to. However, that's, you know, in a holding place at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks, Madam Chair.
David, I've just got a question following on from Councillor Johnson's first around the implications if we were to stop. The aspect of the work that considers earthquake-prone buildings, because that is intertwined into the wider master plan, that ongoing work would essentially stop as well, wouldn't it, if we didn't proceed?
Yes, you're right, Madam Chair. Remember, though, that the council did some other earlier work just on the structural engineering components of that, so that was fed into the work that this group were doing as part of the master plan. So that piece of information is still there. That was reported to council, help me, David, I'll say maybe 2 years ago. So that work's there, and then there's the integration of what would be done in this work that would actually take that into a master plan rather than just a structural fix on an existing building.
Okay, but in terms of am I correct in that the previous work that had been done specifically around the earthquake-prone buildings didn't actually provide budgets or practical steps to address the issues? It was more of a high-level, what structural work had been identified?
It was simply a structural engineering assessment of what would needed to be done to earthquake-proof the library building.
Thank you.
I think just to clarify, I think we might just get Bryce Hoskins. It looks like, Bryce, you want to make a comment?
Good morning, councillors. Group Manager Property, Bryce Hosking. So the earthquake-prone work is continuing in its current form, but one of the assumptions that would be made should this stop is we would be looking to basically maintain the existing earthquake-prone buildings in their current locations, essentially, and we would be continuing down that investigation route. So we are constantly across the portfolio continuing that work, understanding exactly what elements are earthquake-prone, what would need to be done, and potentially looking at designs, and that has to continue because essentially we, as was rightfully pointed out, we have a 15-year time frame, so we can't actually pause that work or we will find ourselves in a bit of a pickly situation.
Thank you. That's obviously the technical term in terms of where we could find ourselves. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in regards to the amount of 350, is that different from the shortfall of the overall funding that we've got allocated in our long-term plans for the overall planning aspects of this? Because I thought we had funded up to so much and there was a shortfall. I'm not sure if you could answer that, David, or whether I should go through it.
Well, one of the Davids can answer it. I mean, David, you might want to, but the money that's allocated, identified as I suggested some for councillors to consider in this paper, includes the work for the consortium to finish what they're doing in terms of the master plan and the integration of what the earthquake needs to be done within the master plan for the precinct. But it also allows for some additional funding in terms of comms and communication that was picked up from the last council meeting.
Can I understand the two separate amounts? So there was an amount that was a shortfall anyway, and now we're asking for an additional amount to slow down the process or whatever the words are and absorb the work and correct councillor feedback. What amount of dollar figure does that equate to? Or are we talking, I just want to understand, because surely it's not 350,000, that's why I want to differentiate the two
so
budget shortfalls.
The original work in terms of the original budget post for July for the next 3 months work that was going to be done to be finished by October originally in terms of the contract was 250,000. The additional 125,000 that's been added to this proposal is to do two things. One is to accommodate an estimate of variations from ARUP to do the extended work which will carry them beyond this year and probably into next year in terms of the communication and stuff, and some more funds for the council budget for stakeholder engagement.
Okay, so I'm more correct to understand that the slowing down the process and get councillor feedback in is more around 125,000, not
Yep.
not what this report kind of presents as being.
So the money in the report is the money required to do the last stage of the original contract that wasn't funded, and that's why there is, to answer Councillor Johnson's question, the ability to stop now was put into the contract by the Chief Executive, so the councillors had that option.
Mm-hmm.
So that additional money was around 250,000. I'm going from memory there. It was either 225 or 250. And then council's staff have added the additional money as an estimate for what the extension would be for the consortium to do the extra time and some money for consulting. So that's call it 150 is the extra bit, because the 250 is the base.
Okay, that's helpful. Madam Chair, can I just ask a question of you? Are we able to ask questions on the actual slide deck of the workshop that we had updating us of the details of scenario 1, 2 and 3? Can we ask questions on?
Yes, the slide deck is attached to the officer's report, and so from my point of view, David is presenting his report, which includes that attachment.
Great. So can I follow on with some questions on
Absolutely.
that? So in the report, it mentions on page 89, which is a summary of a little graph that shows play, work and live in the as important aspects of investment for the precinct. And yet in scenario 1, there's got no live aspects to it, which I'm going back now to page 79.
Correct.
With the tick boxes. And so, and yet it's got aspects like a cultural hub and other things which would, I'd imagine, need more public investment, not private investment. I'm not sure whether, and it's got that emphasis of that early investment, but the Te Manawa gets a, what's the wording that you're using, like it gets an upgrade of sorts, but does that deal with, it's got on, sorry, if I can go back to page 90, which is a better summary of the context, page 90 on our order paper at least. It's got in the bullet points that it's going to have a major refurbishment of Te Manawa, and yet in the library it's got the seismic upgrade. And so I'm just understanding that the Te Manawa needs seismic upgrade too, so we haven't lost sight of the fact that that's...
No, I mean, that's just a wording issue, but...
And that's going to be as is, where is, and that's going to get dealt to.
So scenario 1 is the lowest cost, least change, limited scope option.
Yeah.
And it's basically been presented as a continuum rather than an either or. This is the bare minimum, which would be something that would provide an upgrade. It would meet statutory requirements structurally. It would give some improvement, but it doesn't meet all of the aspirations, and that's where the others come through. But as you go to the other scenarios, obviously the changes are bigger, the dollar sum's bigger, the integration's bigger in terms of the bit that hasn't come yet, which will be the public-private funding, how that's actually constructed and that work. So that's, so you're right, the whole thing is based around a live, work, play as the optimum desire for the city centre. What they're saying is scenario 1 gets you partway there, and if that was the limit to what council wanted, then that would be better than what we've got now, but it wouldn't be their ultimate suggestion as to where it goes, based on the fact of the feedback that they've been getting from the communication to date.
Okay. And then if I can go on to, which starts to be included, this 550 to 600 seat banquet hall, do we have enough bed nights even in the city? 'Cause I noticed that this scenario doesn't have a hotel option, and even with the hotel options with 40 rooms and 50 rooms in scenario 2 and 3, I thought there was a limitation on how many bed nights the city had as on offer currently that wouldn't cater anywhere near the 550, 600 seat banquet hall type of conference event scenario.
I think I'm not an expert on the detail on that, but my understanding is that you're not going to have everybody that's at a 500 or 600 banquet all having accommodation requirements. So there's some ratios on that. In other words, there will be some local people that will be attending, so that you don't have to have accommodation for the number of seats in a banquet type situation, one. Secondly, my understanding is that they've included some hotel accommodation options in terms of the principles, not the final number of beds. And jumping ahead, I know that in the current market, the concern is how big the hotel accommodations would be in the early stages of the long-term plan because of the economics of that at the moment for hotel construction. And you just need to look at Auckland where that challenge is. So there's a timing issue in terms of when the additional capacities might be brought in, which obviously is the next stage in the process.
Okay. I guess my line of questioning, just as you might have picked up, is just working out the fundamental flaws and even some of these concepts. Can I ask through you, Madam Chair, what the arena capacity is for doing a sit-down banquet call? Maybe if the property manager had an idea of that figure, or
yeah, I don't know the answer, but Bryce might or might not, but maybe I'd get you the answer.
Yeah, apologies, no I don't. I've definitely not aware of investigating that in the past. That would probably require some investigation to give you an answer on that and come back to you. Okay,
I might have some comment otherwise.
The Chief Executive has confirmed he is going to phone a friend.
Okay. Yeah, because I know we've had banquets there, and we don't have them every week, and I'm just wondering, you know, the investment needed for that type of investment for the banquet halls. I just wanted to be clarify.
I can also add that, I mean, we're hosting the Local Government New Zealand conference at the arena, which will be a sit-down dinner, and we're expecting between 600 and 700 people for that.
Yes.
And that will comfortably happen.
Yeah. Okay. Perhaps I'll leave it for questions and come back later for comment. Thank you.
Madam Chair, could I just add that some of these comments obviously have been feedback from those who have provided local information to the team. So those numbers and the requirements reflected in here, which is what the report was about, was feedback from those that are currently involved in the convention centre or the library or the art gallery or whatever. So the report's very much hoovering that information up and saying these are the sorts of things that are being presented as to what the city needs within the facilities and how we might accommodate that.
Mr. Murphy would also like to make a comment on that.
Yeah, just briefly in terms of the attachment and the slides, obviously we're happy to answer questions, but just bear in mind we don't have as you'll be aware, we don't have the consultancy team here this morning, but I just alert you to page 14 of the order paper in terms of next process. Like if the committee or council does decide to proceed with this project in terms of the revised timeframe, one of the things we have scheduled in there in late June is a follow-up to the earlier workshop with the consultancy team that would allow the elected members to dig in to some more detail in terms of the slides and the material that's being produced thus far. So I'm not saying don't ask questions about the attachment, but just bear in mind if we do proceed, there is that workshop scheduled, but we'll do the best to answer what we have today.
And just to add to that, because the recommendations are to refer this to the annual budget debate, there would be an opportunity for any additional programs being added to the annual budget for questions to be asked of those programs. I would expect there would be an assumption from elected members they could put those questions. So, okay, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. At the workshop that we had a month ago, one of the consultants said that the costings were being done and were imminent. Have those costings been provided to officers?
In short, no. We just stopped everything at the council meeting and said don't do any more work because that was our understanding of where it's at. So everything's been put on hold until we know where we're going from here and how we handle it from here.
So the costings that had been worked through and that were imminent, not even an indication of those costings been provided to any officers?
No, we haven't. We've just asked everybody to down tools until we had clarity as to what we were asking them to get.
So can I ask officers, are officers aware of any indicative costings for any of the options?
As Mr Warburton said, we haven't had those costs provided.
So if the work has already been done, what would be the best way for us to find out what had the indicative costings that have already been done, because the consultant told us that they were imminent and that work had been done? Is there a way that we could find that out?
There's probably, I mean, the best option is the proposed workshop later this month, which would actually allow questions to be answered and the cost options to be brought in at a high level. But
Okay.
It's not the detail, which is actually, the detail work is the July on work, which is actually the next stage in the process.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking for the detail,
I
but I
realise.
thought that the costings were in that first 490,000, not in the second 200,000. That was what had been originally communicated. But I'll move on. So the work to date, so we have two draft master plans. We have the one that was presented to us just over 3 years ago that didn't have costings or timeline. And now we have another draft master plan with 3 options that also don't have costings or timeline. Is there anything, aside from the fact that the library has been included in this one, is there anything else that this current draft master plans adds that the first one didn't provide?
Yeah, the scope that was workshopped with council back in 2019 did include some additions around the cultural centre, the Enviro Hub, but in essence, the scope is similar, but includes the library, the Enviro Hub, and the cultural centre as well.
Okay, and so moving to, so going back, sorry, this does go back a few years, part of the discussion when we acknowledged that the library needed to be included in this work was the possibility that, given Te Manawa also would need some work, whether there would be consideration of amalgamating both of those programs and looking at whether there could be one building to provide both of those services rather than having two, because, and it was acknowledged that there was a bit of an overlap in terms of the living room to the city, inviting people in. I did raise that at the workshop, and it appeared that the consultants hadn't that hadn't been passed on as part of the initial thinking. Has there been any work done on that concept? And also going back to the discussion, I think when Debbie Duncan spoke to us about that, there was going to be some scoping work done of the library to determine what sort of square meterage was needed, and that was going to feed into this consideration of what would be needed going forward. And that whole discussion seems to have been lost somewhere, and I'm just wondering if it has been included or picked up at any point along the way.
Through you, Madam Chair, a couple of points. I think your first question, Councillor, my understanding is that there was a lot more work done this time in workshops with Rangatani in terms of how the whole vision of the city and the master plan would reflect some of those aspirations. So I think there was quite a lot more work done in those areas in this, which led to a lot of the principal scenarios that came through. The second thing, in terms of your second question with regard the integration of the library to Manawa and other facilities, this is the first presentation that you got, which was very much the presentation of what the group heard from the community. You will recall that no one questioned that the consortia had a lot of international experience, but there was a concern that they needed to get a better feel for what the local community wanted. So the presentation was very much, this is what we're hearing that everybody wants, this is what Rangatani feel these are the things that fit that. And the next stages in the process were to take it further. And some of the presentation that they gave reflected that. So there are conversations that they have held that I am aware of that involved integrating the library, potentially even part of the civic administration facilities, Te Manawa, and how some of those integrations could occur, and that would be part of, if you like, the master planning space. The physical spaces have to remain the same because those are ones that the council own. In other words, the library is where the library is, but it may include other facilities in the future, and you could see those coming through in the third option in particular. So that has been looked at. It is being taken through to the next stages in the process of how you would optimise that.
Okay, just two more questions, if that's all right. The 350,000 that's being asked for in recommendation 1 wasn't included in our draft annual budget that we consulted the community on. I'm just wondering why there was no program included, because bringing it in at this stage means that we haven't had the opportunity to get any feedback from our community about whether that's something they're comfortable to include.
Yeah, that was a decision that was made by the Chief Executive at the time. As you'll recall, there were some delays to the project due to COVID, but there was also some challenges in terms of arranging workshop times with council. So as a result, there was some uncertainty around the project and the future of the project. So the decision was made not to include a budget for 2022-2023.
Okay. And just the final question is a bit of a follow-on from the question that Councillor Johnson asked. So if we were to not proceed with recommendation 1 today, what would the alternative options to move forward with addressing the earthquake-prone building situation? And can that work be done or continued through internal current resources?
I'll just ask Bryce to speak to that.
In short, yes, it will. This building, for instance, is the seismic work from a like-for-like standpoint is actually commencing next financial year, as councillors will be aware. In terms of LTP timing, we've pushed the library and Te Manawa out to the back end of that in an effort to try and align to some of the decisions around this. Should this stop or not proceed, there will be an element of work that will need to continue for each of those buildings, purely in a seismic sense. If I look at that as an overall sort of project, the way we would do it, each building that's earthquake prone will have a number of options in terms of a solution. That'll range from like-for-like strengthening through to potentially a rebuild in some cases. So that work would have to sort of continue to get to a point that eventually it'll come to the council chamber for some decisions. I suppose it's probably more, my advice would be around understanding the alignment to this process and making some decisions in that vein.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Can I just add to that answer? I guess the opportunity cost is losing the potential integration to have a hard look at how the money that will need to be spent in this building, Te Manawa, the library, for instance, can be repurposed to take the city forward rather than just fixing what's there. And that's always been one of the drivers of this piece of work, is to look at that opportunity that is, the opportunity that's presented by having to invest in those buildings and thinking differently about the future of the city.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Sorry, just can I follow?
No. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hoping to ask a question through you to the Chief Financial Officer. Just reflecting on the budget debates that we had, I think there was an indication there that we had a reasonable level of certainty around about a 1.5 million surplus being available, and from memory we were highly successful in committing about 1.45 million of the 1.5. Just wondered if we could get a comment around updating the view as to what the actual surplus will be and whether 350 is reasonable to accommodate within that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Barrett, through you, Madam Chair. Now I've figured out how to work the microphone. Just on that, yes, I did make that comment in the Committee of Council. I guess it's a level of comfort as the position that we were thinking at that time. The current surplus is sitting around 6 million, but within that there are two operating programs that are funded slightly differently, being the digital ERP replacement project. So if we exclude those, the surplus is sitting around about the $4 million mark. That means that there is room to accommodate a request such as this. We are trying to find a balance to not overcommit that surplus by giving some ability to keep to the policy direction of repaying some debt with some of the surplus, but acknowledging that the size of the surplus this year is quite sizable. So there would be room to accommodate a request such as this.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank Kathy for the report. Sorry, I've got a bit of echo going on. My question is around the budgets as well. I'm just trying to wrap my head around. At the moment, we're looking at 300K, but on page 15 it talks about cost increases, and it says that the exact detail was not known at the time of writing this, but it would be provided to councillors on the 8th of June, which is today. So I was just wondering, is that basically what that is?
The additional sum that's in the council paper is our estimate of what the additional costs will be to complete the project, and we don't have that final detail because that will depend a little bit on what councillors choose to do on the next steps in the process as to what the additional sum will be. But we estimate it to be in that 350,000 bracket, which is in the paper.
Okay, so this increase in cost just relates to the amount that's already put in the paper, not extra costs over and above what we're asking for here.
Not sure I follow your question. What we're suggesting is that to complete the work from where we're at the end of June will be about another 350,000, allowing for the extra work that ARIP will do with the extended time and the additional stakeholder engagement.
Okay, I guess I'm not really following what's written in the paper. Already said what the extra amounts is in the, I guess, first page, but then at the end it says that the amounts are not actually known, but will be provided to councillors today.
Well, we'll ask Mr. Murphy to comment on that, Councillor.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So just to be clear, it was going to cost $220,000 to complete the project in terms of that final stage, which is subject to the contract extension. So at this stage, we anticipate it will be an additional $130,000 to extend the program as per the timeframe outlined in the paper and include a significant public engagement exercise. We're continuing negotiations with ARIP around that, the amendments to the contract. So those discussions are continuing, but at this stage, as Dr. Warburton has said, we anticipate, it was going to be 220 to finish it, but we're anticipating it will be 350 to finish it, including the contract amendment and the engagement exercise.
Okay.
But those negotiations are continuing with the consultant.
And in terms of the comment in the paper, which Councillor Dingwall's referred to, would it be fair to assume that staff possibly wrote the report and then came back and tidied up the recommendations once they had that figure? Would that be the reference to them saying at the time of writing this?
Well, at the time of writing the report, we were anticipating a response from ARIP about how much it was going to, the extension or the amendment was going to cost, and those negotiations are continuing. So $350,000 is still what we anticipate to be the estimate to complete the project.
Councillor, does that answer your question?
Not really. I guess my question is there then a risk that even if we said yes to this, we would still potentially be under and needing more?
I think if you approve these resolutions, we would ensure that the project is completed within this budget.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. That last round of questionings probably covers off quite a bit of what I was going to ask. But I guess when I actually read the paper, and I've heard the responses so far, would it be a fair assessment that, for example, if we kind of sort of dropped everything now and we didn't approve the $350,000 to be funded out of current surplus, would it be fair to say that we may never actually reach a point where we have a civic and cultural master plan to even engage with the public on? Would that be fair?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. It's following on from the questioning that Councillor Dennison outlined around the extra 130,000. So, to be clear, the extra 130,000 is paying for what exactly, in addition to what we had anticipated would happen? What I've written down is what I've heard, which is it's going to take longer to complete the work and significant public engagement. Can we have some more detail around what exactly this extra 130,000 is going to provide?
We can, and the detail depends a little bit on some of the timeframes because there are some options that council need to decide on the next steps. So holding the consortium together will cost funds if they roll into 2023 as opposed to finishing them in 2022. There will be costs associated with that. So that's part of the negotiation that we will have to have post the decision of this meeting, depending on which way the councillors choose to go. So, as David Murphy said, there's more stakeholder engagement, there's additional workshops that have been taken into account, plus the material that's already in the budgets for the $250,000 for the work that is yet to be done as part of the original contract in the final stage, which is the bulk of the money, obviously, which is already in the contract.
But the additional work that's going to cost us an extra 130,000 is extra public engagement and additional workshops. Is that it?
The additional workshops, there's following through on any additional work that comes out of any requirements, plus the stakeholders, plus the extra time that's the project's gone on for. There's standing charges that you always have on any contract.
Okay, thanks, Madam Chair.
Can I just clarify? I guess there was some key messages we heard from councillors at the last workshop that was slowing it down, public engagement and greater elected member engagement. In summary, the cost of that will be $130,000.
Councillor Dennison.
So we talked about monthly elected member stand-up sessions, engagement. So it's greater elected member engagement, greater public engagement, and a slowing down of the process to allow the public and the elected members to influence the final stages of the project.
Councillor Dennison.
Further questions, if I can, Madam Chair. Just was there no provision at all for councillor engagement in the original contract or for wider stakeholder engagement that we need another 130,000 for in the budget?
There was allowance for it, but councillors wanted more, so there's additional work for that. There have been some more workshops that have been held in terms of time up until today that was probably beyond what was in the original estimates on the contract for consultation, which has been absorbed by the consultants. So they're saying that the additional consulting engagement work for stakeholders beyond July, they would be charging extra for, which is part of the variation.
Can I just dive deeper? Because we've only had one workshop that maybe went 2 hours, and then we've had one report, and now all we're asking for is like to get up to speed. I'm questioning how it was gauged. Two, one is that there was a workshop. This is probably not necessarily for you, David, but maybe for David Murphy, that at a workshop it's not a decision-making workshop, and yet all of a sudden what was said at that workshop's put brakes on the financials that were imminent, and now $130,000 worth of engaging with us. How did it get from that workshop where we just get a briefing to getting an additional sum that's sizable to us just trying to get up to speed? Like, I think that seems fair. Was there not a budget provision that had us getting up to speed in the original, whatever, 800,000 or whatever the total contract was worth? What is the total contract worth?
630.
The original plan was to engage with elected members a lot earlier in the process. For a bunch of reasons, that didn't happen.
So, but was it not budgeted for, though?
I guess what we're seeing is the elected member engagement is occurring later and is going to be more, I guess, more involved than what was originally anticipated.
Because we've just asked to get up to speed. How do you interpret that it's going to be more involved? Because we've just asked to get up to speed at the workshop, which is not a decision-making body. Like, I'd be in a position to say, oh, let's just carry on and don't spend the 130. Like,
Councillor, can you clarify your question, please?
was the original 600 and something odd thousand plus the extra 200,000, which is more like 800 and something thousand, not including councillor engagement? Or what we're funding now is another 130,000, which I'm at loss to work out where there wasn't a provision.
Councillor, can you clarify your question? If your question is around the original
was councillor
engagement,
not included in the original budgets?
I think that's been answered. They've said it was, but not to the standard that elected members have expressed through the workshop.
Okay.
So elected members have requested an increased level of engagement, and that, I think, is not what has been catered for.
Okay, and then I'll get off to another question.
Yeah, if you've got a further question.
Just another one around the scenario one, which starts. Also, I mentioned about the seat 550 to 600 seat banquet hall, but also I just want to inquire about the new 3-level commercial building that's proposed, and there's examples around the Wynyard Precinct in Auckland, and it's quite a sizable building from some of the images. Has there been a needs analysis around what commercial development space the inner city Palmerston North needs to actually include that in the early case study of option scenario 1, so early on as a need in the design?
Through you, Madam Chair, a couple of things. Can I first of all clarify that the total budget for the whole contract was 30,000, of which the 225 had to be approved separately. So there's only 400 odd to date. The 200 then takes it. 600 is the final budget at the end, so it's not the 800, if that just
Okay,
clarity.
thank you, that's helpful.
So the second part of your question is some early work was done by PwC in terms of discussions, in terms of the market, the opportunities and the costs and so on. The detail, the next stage of that will be done when they do a bit more on the business case, which is part 3 of this proposal, where they're sitting down and working through the detail of that. The reason the commercial place is there primarily is that it's one of the key funding drivers for the non-revenue components of the upgrade and the development. So margin and returns that can be created from the commercial buildings would help to facilitate the upgrades and construction for the cultural civic components, is where that mix comes from. So it's partly the work, play, live scenario, but it's also part of the business case scenario that those entities could easily be built directly by a commercial proposal that would be risked and managed by the commercial sector, and the revenues from that would help fund the other components of the program. So that's where that mix is. The detail hasn't come through, but that's the rationale behind it.
Okay, that's helpful. That's, I'll come back in for comment when there's a chance. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just got a question around the car parking facility that's through a couple of the scenarios. Is the capacity of the car parking building based on the, I guess, increased servicing of the area by way of commercial buildings and those sorts of things? Or where is that specifically come from, and how does it connect to our, I guess, overall strategy? We've sort of been looking to reduce car parking in the city, especially in the city centre. Can you just comment on that?
Yes, I think I can make two comments on it. One is it was put in there to accommodate the proposed development in the city centre. So if you were going to have a convention, if you were going to have those sorts of functions, people would be coming into them. It was a feeling that Palmerston North was a regional hub rather than a metropolitan hub, and therefore there would still be people travelling in likely by vehicle, and so that needed to be taken into account, being cognizant that some of the existing car parking would be lost with the proposals that were being put into place, so it's a replacement. I think the last thing is that there's also recognition that with the shift to non-carbon-based vehicles, e.g. electric or hydrogen or whatever, there will still be likely to be a car even with a carbon-neutral mindset, and that would need to accommodate car parking requirements rather than no vehicles at all, i.e. just no internal combustion engines. So that mix and match was what led to those sorts of conversations. The absolute number in the car park building obviously is still will be refined in the next stages in the process, almost beyond the master plan, because that's starting to get into construction details and returns on investment.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I'll just hand it over to the Chief Executive, who might have an answer to an earlier question.
Yeah, just answered your question, Councillor Desson. So if you do sort of round table style banquet setting at the Conference and Function Centre, I think you can do up to about 300, and if you went to Arena 2 and did it there, you could be 1,500.
Thank you for that. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just a further question. On page 32, in the work to date, the timeline, the last part of that is funding and financing, and that had certainly been communicated a month ago that that was in the work to date in this stage, and what's been said today is that it's in the next stage in part 3. I'm just wondering why that's changed, and if we don't proceed with part 3, will we still be provided with the completion of the work that's been paid for in this current financial year, even if it's been slowed down a bit, including the funding and financing?
You will get the information that's indicated here, which is the principles of how it would be funded and financed, and, if you like, quantums. I don't think it will give you, if you're looking, how much will it cost to build X and Y and Z and when will you do it? That comes after you've done the business case and the detail. But the principles, as indicated there in terms of how it could be funded, and some of the comments that I've already made in terms of the funding and financing options, they will come through as part of the process, and you will get indicative numbers on terms of the costs, is my reading of the detail. But unfortunately, Arup isn't here, or the consortium, to actually give you that detail, but that's my reading of where they're at.
So what they communicated as being imminent in the work that had been done,
that indicative costing that will be provided to us. Am I correct at understanding that correctly?
Yes, but what you consider to be indicative costs and what they consider to be funding and financing options may be slightly different on detail. That's the only bit that I'm not aware of, Councillor Naylor. Does that make sense? If you're looking for a number that says option 3 will cost X $1 million, they may not be in a position to give you that number with any degree of confidence at all. What they'll say is this is how it could be funded and this is the financing options, and on a square foot basis this is the sort of dollar values that you would be looking at.
Okay.
Is that what, if that's what you're looking for, I think you'll get that, but you won't get any detailed breakdown from the costing details.
So it'll be a high level methodology to be able to put some estimates in place.
Correct, because that comes in stage 3 in terms of how you'd work through the detail and the buildability of it.
Okay, and just final question, with this work being slowed down and obviously stage 2 perhaps taking a bit longer, is there any carry forward from this year's budget?
We're not proposing any carry forward.
So are you suggesting that we are going to spend all of this year's budget, even though the work hasn't been completed and is slowing down?
I anticipate that the bulk of the budget that was in this financial year, which is $250,000, will be spent, yes.
Okay, thank you.
There may be some negotiation on the last few weeks of the delay as part of finalising what has to get done, but David Murphy's comment's valid. 90% of it's already been spent. We've only got the last month. Yep.
Thank you, David and Kathy. There's no further questions. And Bryce for jumping in as well. So we've got 2 recommendations. I'm happy to move those. I'll look for a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Hancock. So recommendation 1, that the committee refer $350,000 to complete the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan, including public engagement, to the June Committee of Council deliberations on the final annual budget 2022-23, and that the committee note consideration of this program as a one-off operational expenditure in 2022-23 to be funded from the 2021-22 operating surplus. Just in brief, I think that the most appropriate place to make the decision for this, particularly around the budget, is alongside our annual budget deliberations and our final considerations of what that will look like. I think that we've taken a reasonably measured approach throughout the year when we have had substantial requests for funding come through committees, where we have said actually the best place to do that is at a higher level in considering all of the other implications of the annual budget. So whilst the questioning's been really good in terms of the detail of where to and what this looks like, I think ultimately that's the best environment to make the decision. In terms of the work that has been done to date, I have been really encouraged by the ambition that has come through. I know that there are lots of points to consider throughout what is being proposed, and certainly there's still further work to be done, but the engagement with the community has been reasonably thorough so far. The engagement with Rangitane has been quite solid, and I have really appreciated their engagement really early on. I think what was highlighted at the workshop was that elected members certainly haven't been as a part of the journey as our community have, but I don't think that all is lost, and so I do think that we need to consider our appetite for continuing this and at least having the master plan. Councillor Naylor's mentioned a couple of times the timelines, and this has gone on for a number of years, and it would be really nice to see a master plan actually completed after a couple of attempts and a number of years on this. So I would encourage you to support it and have a fuller debate at the annual budget deliberations. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The recommendation in front of us give me, at least, I understand that this is the only amount we are spending on whole of this master plan. Can I suggest that there should be an additional word that the committee refers an additional amount of $350,000? Because otherwise, people who are reading this order paper will think that this is the only amount we are spending on this whole plan.
We can add in the final phase. I mean, the word "to complete" indicates it's the final piece of the work, but we can specify, refer 350,000 to complete the final phase of the master plan, if that gives more certainty to understanding that it is the last piece of the work, because that is not the total budget. We know that phase 1 and 2. Phase 1 and 2? The final phase. Yep. Okay, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't be supporting referring this additional budget through to the annual budget process. Whilst the Chair has got some confidence that there's a measured approach to things that have been referred, my observation is that to date, everything that's been referred to that process from committees have been included, and there's certainly not the same time when we're looking at the whole annual budget to consider the detail of specific projects. So my view is that today is the appropriate time to determine whether we have the appetite for further investment into this project. I personally don't have appetite to invest this level of further investment into this project at this time. I'm really actually quite disappointed. It feels a little bit like deja vu to just over 3 years ago when we were presented another draft master plan and asked to endorse it at that time. Council didn't endorse it primarily because it felt like there needed some costings, a timeline about how that would be implemented going forward, and we felt that it needed further consultation with our community before proceeding. I'm still at a loss to understand why it seems that we've repeated a lot of the work that had already been done. I actually thought that most of us thought that the original master plan had was quite good and had most components of what we would be looking for in a cultural and civic master plan, although it needed the library to be added in. And this one does have the library added in, as well as a cultural centre and an environment hub, and has had some engagement with iwi. So this one has been got a little bit more, perhaps, than the take one. So we've got 2 draft civic and cultural precinct master plans that have been presented to us. This one's cost us so far close to $500,000. I can't recall how much the first draft cost us. But there has to be a time where we say, is this the right timing for us to invest a lot more work to develop the detail of something that probably our community can't afford at the moment? There is nothing to say that those master plans cannot still be referenced or used as a guide and work that goes forward. We've had good reassurance from Bryce that the earthquake strengthening work will proceed on each building, whether we say yes to this or not. That is essential work and will progress. So there is comfort in understanding that and having that acknowledged by officers. Sometimes I've heard elect members say we've got no choice because we have to do this because of the earthquake strengthening work. That's been clarified as not being the case. So we can look at the library, we can look at Te Manawa, we can look at the buildings as we need to address them and look at the options for each building. I'm really disappointed and surprised that costings that were indicated to us a month ago as having been worked on by the consultant and being imminent have not been able to be provided by officers, haven't been provided to officers and haven't been provided to us today. Having that high level indication is
does help give context to what it is that we're looking at, and I think that would be valuable. That's been described in the presentation as being a part of this phase, so I do look forward to hopefully getting what we've already paid for, in completion. Because, if we've invested $500,000 of our community's money into something, I hope that what we get from that is actually complete. So no, I won't be supporting this additional funding. Once again, it's a very disappointing process when we've got a draft annual budget that we've taken the opportunity to communicate to our community, and that they've done submissions on, and we've listened to their submissions, that we haven't been able to factor this into the engagement that we've had with our community. I think it lacks integrity for us to throw something like this in at the last minute that we haven't been able to talk to our community about. There's no reason why we can't look at picking up further work to clarify further, continue with a further phase of this at some point down the track, but I don't think this is the right timing for that.
Councillor Hapera.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm going to not support these two recommendations. I thought long and hard about it. I do support the plan, but I can't support this, particularly because it's an extra $130,000, because basically they haven't talked to councillors, and I think that wasn't a good enough reason, and I don't think we should be wearing the cost of it. That really bugged me. So to hear that that's what it's been blamed on is not good enough reason to be doing that. I think at the end of the day, we shouldn't be wearing the can for that, and that's what's going to probably be the headline, but we shouldn't be wearing the can for that. We are part of the process, we're not because of the process. And also, we shouldn't be dipping into the surplus. If you're running a business, you don't dip into your surplus to pay these bills. So I just have real problems with doing that. The Chief Financial Officer wasn't that comfortable with it, so I'm not that comfortable with it. So that's another reason why I won't be voting for this. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have quite a bit of sympathy for the underlying frustrations and concerns that the last two speakers have expressed. It certainly has been a bumpier road, a longer road, and a road that has at times been hard to tell if we've even had the headlights on. But I do think we need to keep the end game in mind here in terms of actually fundamentally setting ourselves up to leverage some private investment alongside what is effectively already a significant committed cost through the seismic strengthening and replacement, no doubt, of some buildings in this zone. That end game is worth working for, it's worth fighting for, and it will take resource. We've asked for more detail, we've asked for more engagement. Those are the sorts of things that do require extra effort and are therefore likely to attract extra cost. Parking this up now sounds easy, sounds fun, sounds just the way to go to some. But what it would do is create a huge loss of momentum. It would mean that the investment to date is effectively sunk. And really, there just isn't that much value in getting half a report. We need to get the job done. I fully concur with the chair that this should be referred through to the annual budget, where we can take a look alongside this and any other matters that need to be clarified in that final budget assessment of the year. This is in the must-do category in terms of getting our city centre right for the next generations.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I really couldn't say it any different way than Councillor Barrett, to be fair. I guess if we look back at why this project ever began in the first place, and it's because it's a spatially disparate cultural precinct that we have here in the city. So previous councillors have obviously voted at some point for us to actually explore what this part of our city might look like in the future. So the additional funding, I think, is really required to ensure that there is proper, deep stakeholder engagement that takes place, and that forms the basis of the planning going forward. The ARIP will have to start to do some work around refinement of options, even before we can actually take this through to any sort of public engagement. So it is fair to say that there is a long way to travel before we even get to any point where we might be able to go out to the public and ask them what it is that they think about the option that they'll be, or options that they'll be presented with. If we stop it now, we may never ever reach a point of even having any plan, let alone a master plan. And this part of our city has to reflect the needs of our whole community, not just some. So $350,000 to be considered for this, for my money, is a good investment. And it's not finite until we go to the council meeting. So please support this. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2019 we started with this, and one of the reasons we did stall it was because of the library building. We've already sunk thousands of dollars into the library building because of the earthquake problems. That building is not fit for purpose. There's also been a lot of money that's been invested in the Te Manawa plans. If you recall, there was great plans and presentations to council from a $25 million building to a $100 million building. So it made common sense to have a master plan. Now, this is probably not the best process that we've ever done. And I think rather than keep regurgitating, we're now in, from 2019, we've hit COVID, we've been there. There's been a lot of things happened since 2022. But I'm not prepared to waste all that money. We are so close now to have a master plan. We have got buildings that we're going to end up wasting money on because we will end up just earthquake-proofing them instead of looking at the design and the investment that we can get into that quadrant. We will lose investors. You're looking at whatever we do, this is hundreds of millions of dollars that council is going to have to spend in the future. But whether it becomes hundreds of millions or 50 million will depend on investment, government investment, third party, and having a proper master plan. So to continue this at 350,000 is just the final stages of the thousands that we've already put into it, and over the years it's probably well over 1 million that we've talked about this in the consultations. Let's finish it, get it out to consultation, and then we can start looking at whether the public like option 1, 2 or 3 or nothing. So let's finish it, but it's short-sighted to stop the investment into this master plan. It means no businesses, it will curtail a lot of investment in the city. It's basically saying we're closed for business. So on that note, I will be supporting the recommendations.
Thank you. It's good to hear the Mayor's views are probably represented in some way. Councillor McCarlid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just speaking in favour or in support of these recommendations. I have to admit that I wasn't here when this first started, so it has taken me a lot of readings and in order to get up to speed with this. But having read the material and having done a bit of research, I think, and having sort of monitored the discussion today, I think we're missing the bigger picture. We tend to be focused too much on the how instead of the why. We have to understand why are we doing this, for example. A lot of the questions have been on the how and wanting to getting to the details, and that's important, and I do sympathize with all the questions and comments that have been made today. But we've heard from officers today of the implications of not continuing with this, and what will happen if we do not continue with this program, or we do not support this work or recommendation. and it will be a huge loss of momentum, as mentioned earlier by Councillor Barrett, if we do not continue this work and putting pause on this work. And plus, the funding will come from a surplus. It's, and I'm supporting this. This is funded from the 21-22 operating surplus, and it's not, us trying to recreate or find more money or finding more money to fund us and that sort of thing. And I think it will be a good investment from us and from the community. We've heard from our Chief Financial Officer of the surplus that we have, and this is only a small splash in that surface. And I think funding $350,000 is not a lot to ask, and it's a good investment for the future. And we'll be doing ourselves a disservice and a disservice to the community if we do not support these recommendations today. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess the question why is a good one. And when I look at the fundamental principles of funding programs, I don't think we have to fund. I'm left with the question, why are we funding an additional $130,000 to engage with councillors on our biggest catalyst project that we'll have in the next 10 years, that I'm at a loss that we have a 2-hour workshop, a 1-hour item, and now all of a sudden, because we had a request at that workshop to slow it down and just get us up to speed, because it's obviously got a long way down the track without us even seeing a picture, that we've put the brakes on, and now it's costing $130,000 to put it back on again. I have to ask, why are we at that situation? And, it does leave the next question of how did we get here? And there is a history lesson to this. Last term, we did have this work about to this point, and all we asked for was, can we have a timeline, a budget, and some community feedback? We haven't heard boo till last month of what that feedback, timeline, and budget was, and it just seems like deja vu. I think it's pretty fair. And so, it's frustrating. That's my first point. Then we get a plan which has got ambition in it, for sure, but just actually like practicality. Do we need a 550 to 600 seat banquet hall when the arena can cater up to 1,500 seats round table? And I'd be surprised if we use that 3 times a year in the last 10 years. If we've used that 3 times a year every year, that's, at least you can play netball, basketball, and have large rock concerts and stuff in that venue. What else are you going to do on the banquet hall that's going to sit there and maybe be used 3 times a year in the inner city? And what's that cost for 3? And if it was double that, I just can't see how that's used. Then to think that we're going to have an event venue like that and not expect people to come from out of town and have bed nights to cater for that. And I'm not sure we've got bed nights in the city to cater for that type of conferencing investment. So that's a question mark for me. Then we go on to scenario 1, which is just the basic scenario. It has a 3-level commercial building that's been compared with the Wynyard Quarter in Auckland Precinct. I'm just going like, okay, are we going to have enough commercial businesses and office space and whatever else to fill up an investment of that scale? And will we actually attract the investment? I'm left with a question mark, and again, why? Then one of the key fundamentals of this is to play, live, and work in this precinct, and there's scenarios that don't even have the live in it. This is like, it's fundamentally flawed to get to this point. I'm just like, I want to, this is the first chance to have some feedback on it, and I want to express that I think we have options here that lead us to go to option 2 and 3, which obviously have more multi-million dollars attached to it. And I'm left frustrated that we've got this far down the track, and this is the first chance we've had as members to have some voice in it. And then we're at this, like, do we carry on or don't we? And do we fund it from the surplus or don't we? And of course, I think it's wise to fund it from the surplus. We've got provision and capacity to do it, and yeah, that would be the best way to fund it right at this point. But should we? That's, and I think probably we should. And then I come to the first recommendation, and it's around the amount, $350, and it's going to go to another budget debate. and possibly get redebated there. But I've got this difference between the 220 that was needed and the 130, which isn't really outlined in this report apart from questions, to discover 130,000 to engage with councillors. This is absurd. It's absurd to have a figure in our budget to engage with us. And I can't believe we've had a project which is the biggest catalyst project we've had in this next 10-year plan, and we've got to consult with ourselves. This is like weird. And so in my recommendations, I'm going to move recommendation 1, an amendment that instead of the 350 in there, that it goes back to the original 220, and I'm not going to fund consultation with us as members. That's my purpose of reducing that amount to go towards the budget, and would seek a seconder. But otherwise, I'm happy that I've outlined my concerns and my feelings and the rationale of why I'm moving this way. Thank you.
Is there a seconder for the amendment? Councillor Johnson seconded that. Just to clarify, it is misleading to say that $130,000 is going to elected member engagement. The question was put multiple times, and it was very clear, the response, that it was public engagement and elected member engagement. There is a combination. So I would request that misleading comments are not continued. We are going to adjourn for a break, and we will be back here at 25 past. When we return, we will be discussing the amendment. All right, councillors, we will resume our meeting. Now, we have got an amendment in front of us which has been moved by Councillor Dennison and seconded by Councillor Johnson. We are moving into debate on the amendment, and I am going to take 3 for and 3 against. We still need to finish the debate on the substantive, and we have got another item in our work schedule which my preference is to try to get through before we break at 12. If that doesn't work out, then we will resume the meeting at the conclusion of the Community Development Committee. So keep that in the back of your mind with the comments that you would like to make. We've got 2 councillors in the queue. Councillor Finlay, are you in the queue for the amendment or the substantive? Thank you. And Councillor Dingwell, are you in the queue for the amendment or the substantive? Sorry, we can't hear you. Just a moment. Do you want to try those comments again, Councillor?
Sorry, I had removed myself from the queue because you said 3 for and 3 against.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so moving into debate on the amendment, Councillor Johnson.
Should we not give the mover first right to speak, Madam Chair?
The mover spoke to it when he moved the amendment.
Cool. All right, thank you. Yes, so look, the reason I'm supporting this is because, you know, I've agreed with things that speakers on both sides have said so far. There has got to be a limit to the amount that we're prepared to spend on this plan. And it's cost enough already. I'm prepared to accept 220 be paid out of the surplus, but I'm not prepared to accept the extra 130,000. I wasn't convinced of the explanations as to why it was needed. And I do think, on the other hand, that it's important that we do complete the master plan and engage with the public on it. And that was always my motivation in asking for public engagement, is that the opportunity be given to the public to say what they think, which they haven't had yet, despite some of the more specialised stakeholder engagement. So I am supporting 220 because I don't want the whole thing to be lost. And I think that this is a reasonable compromise. It's still not really where I'd like to be perfectly honest. But, you know, let's try and be pragmatic and cut through the middle and hopefully come to something that we can all agree on. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Beattie.
I'm actually not supporting the cut because one of the questions that was asked was around the multicultural area, had a multicultural community, and the response was that they'd had some engagement, but they were going back. So what I'm really concerned about is that the public engagement, which is critical, and the stakeholder engagement, which is critical, because that's where we get our design information, our usage information of the buildings, will not be there because we're cutting it out. So all those people that we're going to be engaging with, they'll come back and say, oh, well, no, the actual master plan, we didn't actually consult with those people because you cut the budget. So I don't know how many times I've been in council where councillors have directed staff to go out for public engagements. One of the reserves at Awapuni, we told them to go back out and talk to the public. So now you're cutting the budget to talk to the public. Well, you can't have it both ways, people, so I'm not supporting it.
Acknowledging this is a little bit of poor process, but I think we do need an officer comment on the implications of reducing the budget, particularly because that increase focused on the public engagement. So can I ask either you, David, or Cam to reply?
Yes, so with $220,000 we'd only be able to complete the project as originally planned. So there wouldn't be the enhanced and elected member engagement or public engagement. So for instance, if we look at this resolution, My advice would be that including public engagement would be deleted from that resolution, because there wouldn't be the funds to enable that to occur. Bearing in mind, if it was completed for $220,000, we could then incorporate it within the LTP as part of public consultation, but there wouldn't be a significant public engagement exercise prior to that.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to make a comment as well. So I'm not going to support the amendment. I don't think it's an appropriate time to be shaving pieces of the budget off, particularly when it comes to public engagement. I would rather that we do this properly. I think that it would be short-sighted to place limitations on how we can complete the final phase at this stage. It's been talked about around how long this piece of work has been going on for, and actually my support would be behind just doing it properly to get it done. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I will be supporting the amendment because I think 220 is better than 350. However, I still am absolutely gobsmacked to hear the officer say that the original, that it will, if we cut it, that it will proceed as originally planned without elected member engagement. Who would ever have thought that a program should proceed without elected member engagement? It's fundamentally flawed. And I guess my other comment that I do want to make, the original up to the phase at the end of this financial year, the commitment of 490,000 to the contract. The suggestion of the phase 3 had always been 200,000, so I'm not sure why it's grown to 220. But as a part of the outline of that, it included community engagement. So I'm not sure why that, to say as originally planned, and that didn't include community engagement, I don't think is accurate to how that contract was described.
Councillor, you've misrepresented staff comments. The staff member never said that this would proceed without elected member engagement. There is always elected member engagement. What was established quite clearly, in my view, through Councillor Dennison's questioning, is the increased expectation of engagement with elected members that was requested through the workshop. So reducing the budget as proposed doesn't exclude elected member engagement. It is actually around going back to the original plan of engagement. So just to be very clear. Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will not be supporting this as well. I think having just heard what the officers have said in relation to this, particularly around public engagement. If we're placing limitations on public engagement, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because when we go out to the public, they tell us on what, they give us feedback on policy, design, and all that we need to do in order to improve either the process or the design of the work that we are doing. And those engagement actually improves accountability. The public holds us to account. And it also creates a more inclusive and cohesive community, because the public feels that they are part of something that they belong to. So based on what the officers just said around public engagement, therefore, I would not be supporting this, and I would be supporting the substantive motion. Thank you.
Right, we've had 3 against. Is there, and 2 for, is there anyone else who wishes to speak in favour? I'll go back to you, Councillor, for a right of reply.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the chance to summarise. First off, we are not shaving off the budget. If we were to oppose this, we'd be loading it on to the budget. This budget doesn't exist, and I don't think it should, the additional bit. So I just wanted to differentiate that part. As far as the process, this could have been done much better. And in fact, I almost think the horse is bolted as far as going out for public engagement to see what they think. It's like the work's basically been done, and the suggestion where the officer offered is the next possible time would be in next year's annual plan, which will go out in February, and that will get some feedback. And I think just using the annual plan budget process would be a healthy way of getting the wider feedback if we don't get it directly through once this headline hits the papers tomorrow, because we're going to get some feedback. So I'm not so worried about that. And I don't think, I know the point was made around after I spoke around this amendment that it's not just for elected member engagement. And I do kind of get that, but that's how it feels. That's how it feels to me, that we're needing this budget because we asked for it to get us up to speed, and in the report it says to absorb the information, which seemed fair, but not $130,000 fair. And I don't think that burden should be passed on to our ratepayers, whether it's been used as a surplus or not. So this is pragmatic. This is moving this forward to the next debate that we'll have next week, and I think that's good space to have it. And this moves it along and keeps the project moving, but not with the additional budget that was kind of added with that I just don't feel is justified. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Right, with the right of reply done, we will now vote. We are voting on the amendment to reduce 350,000 to 220,000. And that has carried 8 in favour and 7 against. So we're now moving back to the substantive motion. If you have already spoken, I don't have a list of who's spoken, but we are moving back into the 3 for and 3 against in terms of timing. And we have now got the substantive motion with the reference to the budget reduction of 220,000. So I'll open that up. Councillor Finlay.
No, I think my point's taken. I think I move that the resolution be put.
Sorry, can you use your microphone and can you...
As I have not spoken, I move that the resolution be put.
Is there a seconder for that? So Councillor Finlay has moved a procedural motion that the motion be put. There is no seconder, so we continue. Councillor Bowen. Sorry, we're just pausing for a moment. We're just trying to swap the screens. Sorry, Councillor Meehan, did you indicate you would second the procedural motion?
Yes, I did.
My apologies. We have a little lag between switching screens, so I did miss that. So we have a procedural motion that the motion be put. We're voting on the procedural motion first before we vote on, depending on the outcome. So the procedural motion is that the motion be put now. For clarity, that means that the debate ends and we vote on the substantive motion. That is moved by Councillor Finlay and seconded by Councillor Meehan. Just give us one moment, please.
Point of order, Madam Chair. If the seconder has left the meeting, then we can't continue. Oh, he's back.
The seconder has left the seconder was just computer in.
Right, people are putting my chairing skills to the test today. We have got a procedural motion to put the vote. The procedural motion is coming up on the screen. We are now voting just on the procedural motion. We are not voting on the substantive motion. So what we are voting on is whether or not the motion under debate should be put now. Please vote. Yeah, sorry, just didn't mark it on my phone. That has carried 9 for and 6 against. So we are now moving to the motion. The two recommendations we have got in front of us are, number one, that the committee refer $220,000 to complete the final phase of the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan, including public engagement, to the June Committee of Council deliberations on the final annual budget 2022-23. And number two, that the committee note consideration of this program as a one-off operational expenditure in 22-23 be funded from the 21-22 operating surplus. Is everyone happy for those to be put together?
Can I have them separated? Sorry.
Of course you can. Thank you. We've got recommendation 1 in front of us. Please vote. That has carried 12 in favour and 3 against. We'll now move to recommendation 2. I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 12 in favour and 3 against. We're now moving on to item 8, the Palmerston North City District Plan, Proposed Plan Change G, Ekotiri Urban Growth. We have got Shannon Johnston and David Murphy presenting this. Thank you for your patience this morning, Shannon.
Good morning, Madam Chair, councillors. So, as I said earlier, we've got Shannon Johnson, partner at Cooper Rapley Lawyers here helping today with the presentation. We've got a slide deck which we're going to talk you through. Conscious of time, so we will move through that as quickly as we can, but also conscious that there is 1,000 pages of technical material that we've summarised down into 7 or 8 slides, which we'll do our best to walk you through. Just as the slides are coming up, I just want to acknowledge the work by Michael Dundum, Principal Planner. He's spent a significant amount of his nights and weekends in the last few weeks finalising this significant project for the city. So I just want to acknowledge that piece of work from Michael. He's at home resting, which is where he needs to be, so in terms of his rest. So yes, so just, where's our, have we got the... So just to start with, and I guess in terms of the spatial extent of Plan Change G, so while it is rezoning additional land for development, I just want to make it clear that the spatial extent of Plan Change G does cover existing developed areas, and it also covers some rural residential areas down off Turitea Valley. I guess the scope of the plan change is just not that additional land that's been rezoned, it's also some of those existing rural areas and existing areas that are developed. I guess some of the key drivers or purpose for Plan Change G, so district plan changes give effect to a wide range of strategy and legislation, including the RMA and the NPS. So the officers and the technical staff that have pulled this together have taken a lot of direction from council's strategies and plans, but also the RMA and the NPS. Obviously, a key thing is addressing the residential development constraints in terms of providing additional land for housing and our target, so approximately additional 1,000 lots at Plan Change G. So it provides, I guess, a step change in the development framework for Plan Change G. So for the first time under the RMA, we've got a structure plan to guide a coordinated and well-designed residential area in Okotiri, a precinct plan for a local business zone. So that's not to compete against the local business zone on Okotiri Drive, but to complement the existing residential activity and additional residential activity on Pacific Drive. We've needed to make sure that there's adequate provision of infrastructure to support Plan Change G. And Okotiri is a difficult area in terms of the gully network, which has absorbed, I know, a lot of the time of the experts in terms of the geotechnical and stormwater constraints. So this image shows the structure plan, which is proposed to be incorporated into the district plan. One of the original drivers for this piece of work, I guess, was that there was no plan for a logical conclusion to the Okotiri community or suburb, and that's been one of the key drivers in terms of the structure plan. So at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Shannon, who, along with Michael, has been intimately involved in the detail of the plan change.
Kia ora koutou, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I do just want to acknowledge the work of Michael alongside the technical team that have brought you Plan Change G for your consideration today. I certainly know Michael would have wanted to have been here. You're stuck with a lawyer instead, but I'll do my best. This slideshow essentially is going to try to summarise a stack of technical detail that you would have received in your agenda item. But essentially, Plan Change G deals with the greenfield growth area in Okotiri. There's about approximately 20 hectares of developable land left in the existing Okotiri residential area. So this adds a significant, a larger amount into that pool, alongside zoning of local business, and that deals with the neighbourhood centre, conservation and amenity, and that's the gully network. And then, if you could flick back. You'll see down there towards Turitea the existing rural residential overlay, which has had some additional rural res included, but it incorporates what is already there, essentially, and that's the dark grey. It provides for conventional, and I call that, and the plan change calls that, suburban low-density residential. So what we would call your atypical residential site in today's world, as well as medium-density housing. So there is, through the structure plan process, there is towards the middle of that structure plan, you will see some hatching there, which shows where the medium density is proposed in and around the village area, and then again out towards the plateaus. It provides for in the region of up to 1064 new dwellings, and it's referred to there under the Adderstone Reserve option, which I'll come on to. It provides for the neighbourhood centre, and I do just want to pause here because I think this is an important point. There is a retail case study and technical report that supports Plan Change G, and it does look at the reasons why a neighbourhood centre is important for this area. It reflects the sustainability and efficiency of providing services local to where people are living, and it's also described as an incentiviser for higher density dwellings or living. And of course, as part of your obligations under the NPSUD, the Urban Development National Policy Statement, one of the things that Council needs to be doing is providing different types of housing across different types of densities. So the neighbourhood centre supports that greater density of living, and the retail report says that there is sufficient population created through Plan Change G and existing residents up there to have this neighbourhood centre coexist alongside the Summerhill Drive existing retail area. In order to provide the neighbourhood centre, though, there are some key elements that need to be ensured or met through the structure plan process. So this slide shows a close-up of the neighbourhood centre proposed, and really why we've included this is because it's important to note that access off Pacific Drive. So a successful retail centre or neighbourhood centre needs to have good destination potential, and it needs to be pulling people off that primary thoroughfare into the neighbourhood centre. So that's why when you come off heading in, you'll see the pink, that is a proposed commercial area, and then you head into the neighbourhood centre pure. Because of the importance of how we're going to deliver this neighbourhood centre, there is a precinct plan that is incorporated into the structure plans that you have before you. So I do want to reflect on those structure plans. They're Appendix 2 of your Section 32 report, and there isn't just one of them. There are a number incorporated. There is the overall plan, and then there is also a street hierarchy, a lot pattern and density, and then the precinct plan. And the precinct plan will be incorporated into the district plan, and development will need to be in accordance with that precinct plan. And that's because the structure plan is seeking particular outcomes for a successful retail centre supported by the medium density housing. It provides for a larger anchor tenant and supporting ground level residential uses with the ability for some above floor resi activity in certain circumstances. The reason why it's a little bit more prescriptive is that point around connectivity, but also the fact that these sorts of centres are now being promoted as walkable, pedestrian friendly. The idea being that this precinct is located in good relationship to open space, the street network, which includes cycleways and pedestrian access, and also public transport. Another feature of this plan change is the vesting of the gully network. That is to occur at the earliest stage of subdivision. The gullies will be then, or are under this proposal, rezoned conservation and amenity. That's section 15 of your district plan. Council assumes responsibility for those gullies once vested, and it presents a significant opportunity for biodiversity enhancement and improvement, as well as a recreational opportunity. This is one feature of the structure plan which has been considered carefully, is the ability to connect the developed areas into your recreational spaces and open spaces in a Kotiri. I think that that would be something that the technical advisors would want me to say is a unique feature of this particular plan change and a real opportunity. So what do you do with the structure plan once you have it? We are including it into your district plan as part of a suite of changes to your objectives and policies and also your rules. The structure plan will inform subdivision and development. That must occur in general accordance with the structure plan. I've highlighted here, and we'll skip through them. David's probably looking at his clock, but we'll skip through them in terms of some of the key features of the OBS and POLs, the objectives and policies. They are seeking differing densities and types of housing, and we've reflected on that already. You're ranging from suburban low density to townhouses to the potential for apartments. There's a high amenity neighbourhood centre, and I've already referenced the connection to walking, cycling and public transport. It does recognise the ecological and Indigenous biodiversity and landscape values of the gully networks. This is achieved in a number of ways: the vesting of the gullies, the provision of open space and recreational trails, but also this particular structure plan does have a lot layout aspect to it. That's on the third structure plan that I've just referred you to. It's the lot layout and density structure plan. It actually encourages and directs a grid layout of these lots that accounts for things like positioning to the gullies, landscape, amenity aspects, avoidance of rear lots, access to streets without cul-de-sacs. So there is an overarching amenity feature and incorporation of the gully networks into the design. There's a feature of this in the objectives and policies around stormwater management. Obviously, stormwater needs to be managed in a way that the gully network is protected, and that has been achieved through an overarching stormwater management strategy. Its focus is to achieve hydraulic neutrality with no increase in stormwater effects on the surrounding areas. There is a directive to avoid adverse effects on the gully network through your objectives and policies. You will be managing natural hazards and earthworks, and I'll come on to some geotech issues shortly. The provisions directive around bulk and location, set built form and amenity-based standards. You are seeking particular living environment outcomes through these provisions. In terms of when you're thinking in particular around your medium density, things like sunlight, open space amenity. You are discouraging activities through these provisions with including non-residential that have an adverse impact on the character and amenity of the structure plan area, including the neighbourhood centre. There is a focus on an access to the transport network, and that goes beyond cars to public and active transport. And there is a requirement for key infrastructure to be in place in advance of development, including stormwater infrastructure and transport infrastructure that's necessary to address safety issues emerging out of some of the transportation reporting. This council's familiar on those matters, having previously had a council report. And in other instances where development is occurring, the provisions enable triggers down the path for where levels of service are met, and then further upgrades will be necessitated. There's changes to rules that reflect those objectives and policies, and there's a new MAP 10.1A, and the reason I've included that here is that it does relate to something you'll be familiar with already in terms of a Kotiri and what is termed developable and limited developable land. This MAP 10.1A sits alongside existing 10.1, and it identifies over the structure plan area those areas where the construction of dwellings and buildings and structures will be a permitted activity, and that's where your slope analysis provides what's known as a Class A or B, or where it's Class C, D and E, and where there is greater risk of slope instability and the need for further investigation, it's a restricted discretionary activity. So your structure plan presently highlights where some of the Class D land is. It's towards the edges of the gullies and around the plateaus, unsurprising. And it is not a new issue. It's something that this council and its team are already dealing with in a Kotiri, but it's just extended that work over the structure plan area to ensure that those hazards are being addressed in a similar way. The one change that I do highlight, and I'll do it now rather than on the last slide, is that the restricted discretionary activity is now extended to Class C land. That's slightly different to the existing MAP 10.1, and that's off the bat of geotechnical advice received in respect to this plan change from Tonkin and Taylor. All that it means is that there is the need for geotech advice and investigation to occur where that particular or development is to occur in the Class C area. The provisions have been updated to reflect the fact that those geotech investigations will be required at the time of subdivision. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is anything different to what is happening now. I'm just noting that natural hazards is a factor that has been incorporated into the plan change work. There is a new map, 10.6.33H, familiar to maybe the consenting team, but it is the multi-unit residential housing overlay map. It shows the areas where greater density is provided for, and essentially where you are constructing dwellings in that particular area, you will be caught by the multi-unit provisions in the plan. It just basically requires different performance standards to manage construction of dwellings on smaller footprints and closer together. There is also one other feature of the structure plan I'm going to highlight. It's the 5 metre stormwater buffer no build setback. This is a stormwater management approach, but it's integrated also with protection of the gullies. The structure plan shows that the rear of properties, there's a 5 metre no build setback, which effectively is going to be where stormwater travels through a swale network, and it avoids direct discharge into the gullies. That's just another feature I wanted to highlight. The structure plan includes 2 sets of plans. One's described as option 1 and the other is option 2. Option 1 shows Adderstone Reserve, and it involves a potential partial disposal of the reserve. I'll come on to some reasons around that shortly, but then the next page here shows option 2, which is where the Adderstone Reserve remains in situ, unaffected. So the reason why there's an Adderstone Reserve option is that the Park and Reserve Servicing Assessment identified that only part of Adderstone Reserve was needed for a neighbourhood reserve function. Their analysis, and this formed part of the 32, showed that once the reserve needs are met, alternative uses for the balance of Adderstone Reserve could be investigated. And one of those options is housing, and that's what this suite of structure plan options shows. So it shows the retention of part of the reserve for reserve purposes, and that would meet the reserve requirements for this plan change alongside the other reserve areas that have been identified as part of the structure plan, and obviously the gully network. It would produce the addition of 14 new dwellings, so the difference of 1050 and 1064. And I think that this picture, if I'm looking at it closely, the red areas might be those where not deemed necessary, yeah. So those are the ones that could, I'm just trying to give you a good spatial understanding of what I'm describing, but the red areas are the areas that have been deemed unnecessary. You might think, why is there 2 options being presented as part of the process? That's because the final option is still being determined. The statutory process for the partial repurposing or the change in use is obviously subject to a separate statutory process. That statutory process is still to commence. The key from my perspective, and for the purposes of this plan change, is that the plan change that you're considering for notification isn't dependent on either option. So the structure plan has been designed to either include the repurposed Adderstone Reserve land as housing or not, and either option can work sensibly. So there's no dependency on the outcome of the Reserves Act process. Because that statutory process was not complete by the time we brought these reports to you, it was necessary to present both. The idea is that before the hearing, there would have been the conclusion of the Reserves Act process, and whichever outcome that is, that would be presented to the hearing panel as the final structure plan. This shows the structure plan 7A.3E. If you compare that to the earlier structure plan, 7A.3, that David showed you on slide 3, it's essentially the structure plan that includes the Adderstone Reserve with the use of some of that land as repurposed housing. This final slide just reinforces that this has been a comprehensive technical process with input from a range of experts, and I've described it as a master plan approach, and you would have seen in your Section 32 report that there is a master plan at Appendix 3 which sets out the urban design framework and the outcomes sought through the structure plan. That will be a supporting document that applicants, council officers, the community can reference when looking to understand the structure plan, and it sets out the many multidisciplinary inputs that have gone into producing the plans for you. Many issues were addressed through that process, with others that have been identified, transport, stormwater, natural hazards addressed also through provisions. I have noted a few points to round this out. There is the transport roading network matter and the need to ensure that there is adequate infrastructure in place before development. Council has undertaken to receive a report on the work program for the improvements required at some of the key intersections that came out of the transportation reporting as part of the plan change process. I understand that that work is in train. The stormwater management strategy is all-encompassing. So David mentioned earlier that the structure plan area encompasses some existing residential development. When GHT looked at the stormwater management proposal, they've counted that stormwater from existing development as well. So the strategy addresses all stormwater from all development within the structure plan area. And the reason for that is to ensure that effectively the existing stormwater management isn't grandfathered, so that there's room to also be able to seek improvements in stormwater management of those areas as well. We've discussed geotechnical analysis. Tonkin and Taylor's advice has involved us preparing map 10.1A, as I've noted, and just reinforcing council's existing approach to natural hazards around those gully edges and in some areas. There is provision for a retirement village in the structure plan area. You will see on all the structure plans that there is a window that has a retirement village variation. Essentially, this just highlights that in the place identified on the structure plan, an applicant has the option of either using that land for medium density housing or using the land for a retirement village. Your Section 10, your residential section of the district plan, already contemplates some non-residential activity in a residential area. All that this does is that highlights that this retirement village has the potential to be incorporated into the structure plan area. It needs to be incorporated into the structure plan area in a way that still upholds the intent of the structure plan and the design and character, amenity, environmental outcomes that have been sought through the structure planning process. So there have been provisions included to help assist with the design and implementation of that retirement village option should it be pursued. And finally, I just want to note, as we've discussed, the vitality of the neighbourhood centre, which is location, activity and density driven. So there has been a layer of protection put into the structure plan process around, firstly, the precinct plan, but then also through objectives, policies and rules to ensure that that neighbourhood centre is given the best possible chance of success. I don't know if I've done 190 pages justice, but that's the speed session on Plan Change G. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Shannon. There are a number of questions, so we are going to need to adjourn now for lunch and resume at the conclusion of the Community Development Committee. When we come back, we will go straight into questions. So elected members will just need to make a note of that. Great. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back in here at 1 for Community Development Committee.